among other things. And we've got a Braves fan, Georgia Bulldogs fan, among other things. We're excited about his lecture this morning, which will be on Southern Baptists and higher education. I think it's very, very good. And then I want to remind you, at noon we have a Q&A session, and we have a free Chick-fil-A lunch, which I know all folks will be excited about, to get some free Christian chicken. So, but thank you all for coming out this morning, and without further ado, I'm going to invite Dr. Finn back to the podium.
Thank you. Well, good morning. It is a joy to be back here again for the third lecture in the lecture series. For those of you who were unable to be here yesterday, or maybe you just slept so well you've forgotten what we're doing, that would be a good reason to forget if you slept so well. Our theme for the lecture series is Southern Baptists and cultural engagement. And what I've tried to do is step back and look at three different spheres of culture: politics, and we talked about church and state; science, we talked about Southern Baptist responses to Darwinism; and now higher education. Education being the third sphere that we're going to look at. And these are all just snapshots of the various ways that Southern Baptists have looked at these things. This particular lecture I'm excited about, not only because I live and move and have my being in the world of Baptist-related higher education, but because I get to talk about a dear friend and a key mentor and your interim president, David Dockery, who's deeply shaped the way that I think about these things. And so this is an opportunity to give honor to whom honor is due, while also staying very much within the parameters of what we're talking about with Southern Baptist cultural engagement. So I've titled this particular lecture, Evangelical by Conviction, Baptist by Tradition, David Dockery's Vision for Southern Baptist Higher Education. On February 1st, in the year 2018, it looks like our clicker might not be working. We're having clicker problems. Someone's got ESPN on their phone. You know, it wasn't on. So there are some things I know a lot about. Technology is not one of them. So on February 1st, 2018, the Council of Christian Colleges and Universities, the CCCU, awarded David Dockery the John R. Dellenbach Global Leadership Award. According to the CCCU, the annual award is, quote, presented to an individual who has made outstanding contributions to Christian higher education through scholarship, writing, and public influence. In many ways, Dockery was an obvious choice for this award. The CCCU press release noted that at the time of the award, Dockery had served as president of two different prominent Christian universities: Union University from 1996 to 2014, and Trinity International University from 2014 until 2019. He was moving towards retirement there whenever he received the award. Dockery had authored or edited several influential books related to Christian higher education, in addition to writing numerous journal articles and contributed essays on the topic. He had served as chairman of the board of directors for the CCCU, as well as the Consortium for Global Education. And at the time of receiving the award, he was serving as board chair of the Christian College Consortium, another group, and president of the Evangelical Theological Society. Now, despite his accomplishments in evangelical higher education, Dockery's reception of an award from CCCU would have been unlikely a generation earlier. Dockery is a lifelong Southern Baptist who's written widely on topics related to Baptist historical theology and Southern Baptist identity, most notably his co-edited volume, Baptist Theologians, and the treatise, Southern Baptist Consensus and Renewal, a biblical, historical, and theological proposal. Union University, where Dockery spent the bulk of his career, is a Baptist institution affiliated with the Tennessee Baptist Mission Board, which in turn is a state convention that cooperates with the Southern Baptist Convention. Prior to going to Union, Dockery taught right down the road at Criswell College, a small Baptist-related college in Texas. He served as a professor and chief academic officer at Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, the oldest SBC-related seminary, and he was the academic editor for the Baptist Sunday School Board, now Lifeway Christian Resources, the Southern Baptist denominational publishing house. Not surprisingly, based on his distinguished Baptist pedigree, Dockery was not only honored by CCCU in 2018, but he was also honored by the International Association of Baptist Colleges and Universities. Dockery had previously served on the board of that organization, and in June 2018, he delivered the Distinguished Hester Lecture for that group for the second time. Tellingly, his 3 lectures focused on the future of Christian higher education in the evangelical tradition and educating leaders for the Baptist future. Throughout his career, Dockery's influence has been felt in the oft and increasingly overlapping worlds of Southern Baptist higher education and evangelical higher education. But these worlds have not always overlapped. In fact, it has not been uncommon over the past couple of generations for Baptist scholars to periodically ask whether Southern Baptists should even be considered evangelicals, and if so, what type of evangelical? These discussions have been fueled by the inerrancy controversy in the Southern Baptist Convention and post-controversy efforts by both conservative and moderate Baptists in the American South to refine and commend their respective understandings of Baptist identity. Not surprisingly, Dockery himself has weighed in on this discussion frequently, editing books on the topic and regularly weaving the theme into numerous other writings. Throughout his career, Dockery has positioned himself as a self-consciously evangelical Baptist, with both of those terms enriching the other. So this lecture seeks to make a small contribution to 2 different discussions. The relationship between Southern Baptists and evangelicals, that discussion we just referenced, as well as the nature of higher education in the Baptist tradition. David Dockery's career, and particularly his time at Union University, will be used as a window into these larger discussions. During his tenure at Union, Dockery helped popularize what had prior to this been evangelical emphases among Baptist-related colleges and universities. In so doing, he served as a bridge figure between Southern Baptists and the wider evangelical world as the former moved increasingly into the orbit of the latter in the years following the inerrancy controversy. Dockery offered Baptist theological conservative universities an intellectual identity that was distinctive from the moderate vision that predominated among most of the oldest and most prestigious Baptist-related schools. As most of those moderate schools were renegotiating or even severing their denominational ties, the sort of schools that resonated with Dockery's vision became more self-consciously evangelical and strengthened their ties to the Baptist conventions with whom they were affiliated. So let's start by talking about evangelical higher education and a couple of key concepts. Historians and theologians are constantly debating the origins, doctrinal identity, and future prospects of American evangelicalism. I won't rehash those debates right now. But for the most part, scholars agree that the modern evangelical movement emerged in the years following World War II, that it was a trans-denominational movement that coalesced primarily around individuals, institutions, and parachurch ministries rather than traditional denominational structures. And evangelical leaders self-consciously positioned their movement as a sort of healthy, balanced middle between separatist fundamentalism on the right and mainline liberal Protestantism on the left. By far the most famous evangelical was the Southern Baptist evangelist Billy Graham. By and large, evangelicals avoided discussions of ecclesiology since those differences divide denominational traditions, and instead they focused their attention on broad commitments to Protestant theological orthodoxy, missions and evangelism, and faith-motivated cultural engagement. Of course, all of those commitments have been fiercely contested by self-confessed evangelicals and scholars who study evangelicalism. There have been ongoing debates about core evangelical theological distinctives. There are periodic intramural discussions about whether authentic evangelicalism is more Reformed or Wesleyan or something in between. And in more recent years, a number of scholars have focused on the influence of matters like politics, race, gender, and other cultural phenomenon on evangelicalism. Despite this diversity, in 1976, a group of about 40 evangelical colleges founded the Coalition for Christian Colleges, what later became the Council for Christian Colleges and Universities, the CCCU. Among the CCCU's founding institutions, only 3 were related to Baptist traditions: Bethel University, Eastern University, and Campbellsville University. And only Campbellsville was historically in the orbit of Southern Baptist life. Now, if you know much about Southern Baptist history, this should not surprise you. The same year the CCCU was getting off the ground, Southern Baptist leader Foy Valentine was quipping that evangelical is a Yankee word. So Southern Baptists weren't paying that much attention to it. At least Southern Baptist leaders weren't paying that much attention to it. Yet, evangelicalism was culturally ascendant, because also in 1976, self-confessed evangelical Jimmy Carter was elected President of the United States. And Watergate conspirator turned evangelical activist Chuck Colson's spiritual memoir, Born Again, was a bestseller. All this led Newsweek to dub 1976 the year of the evangelical. Of note is that both Carter and Colson were not only evangelical luminaries, but they were also Southern Baptist laymen. This shared evangelical and Southern Baptist identity was a portend of the two movements drifting closer to each other in the 1980s and 1990s. At least 10 more historically SBC-related schools joined the CCCU between 1981 and 2000, followed by at least 9 more schools after 2001. Schools in CCCU circles often emphasized 2 key concepts in shaping a distinctively evangelical vision for higher education. The first is the importance of a Christian worldview. According to Philip Ryken, the president of Wheaton College, a worldview, or world and life view, as some people call it, is the structure of understanding what we use to make sense of our world. Our worldview is what we presuppose. It is our way of looking at life, our interpretation of the universe, our orientation to reality. Worldview language has its origins in 19th century German idealism, and it was imported into Christian circles around the turn of the 20th century. Theologians such as Abraham Kuyper and James Orr first promoted the idea of a Christian worldview, though in the 1970s and 80s, it was scholars such as James Sire, Brian Walsh, Richard Middleton, and Albert Wolters who popularized worldview language in evangelical higher education circles. Sire, a former English professor and longtime editor for InterVarsity Press, provided a list of basic questions for discerning one's worldview. Wolters, a Dutch Reformed theologian, offered an influential framework for Christian worldview built around the grand narrative of Scripture, creation, fall, redemption. Walsh, a Reformed theologian, and Middleton, a Wesleyan scholar, contrasted the biblical world with the modern world, attempting to bridge the gap for the sake of faithful cultural engagement. Building on these thinkers and others, evangelical scholars also focused on matters such as philosophical foundations for a Christian worldview, the influence of Christian worldview thinking on higher education, and the place of Christian worldview analysis in an increasingly pluralistic context. A second key concept championed within evangelical higher education is the integration of faith and learning. The conversation about faith-learning integration has its roots in Dutch Reformed thought, though, as with the emphasis on Christian worldview, it's been embraced by a variety of different types of evangelical institutions. Longtime Wheaton College philosopher Arthur Holmes popularized this terminology in his 1975 book, The Idea of a Christian College, which has become something of a modern classic in Christian higher education. Holmes suggested that there are at least 4 different approaches to the integration of faith and learning, but he argued that all of them recognize that, quote, the Christian faith can touch the entire range of life and learning to which a liberal education exposes students. The reason so many evangelicals believe integration is needed is because of the separation of faith and learning that has accompanied the secularization of higher education, even in schools that began as church-related institutions, a process documented in the influential works of George Marsden and James Burchell, among others. Though not all evangelicals have been enthusiastic about the concept of faith and learning integration, this language has been widely embraced by colleges and universities affiliated with the CCCU. That brings us to Dr. Dockery. David Dockery became the president of Union University in 1996. At the time, Union's identity was closely identified with the West Tennessee region, and though the school was arguably more conservative than its sister Tennessee Baptist schools, Belmont and Carson Newman at the time, many of Union's administrative leaders and religion professors had been sympathetic to the moderate faction in the inerrancy controversy. Union's religion department had periodically experienced controversy over professors' views of the Bible between the 1960s and the 1980s. By the mid-1990s, when Dockery came, the department included both inerrantists and non-inerrantists. The most recent hires had been inerrantists, so it was starting to track in that direction. Dockery himself held to biblical inerrancy, and throughout the 1980s and 1990s, he published widely on the nature of biblical inspiration and authority, as well as hermeneutics, emerging as arguably the leading conservative Southern Baptist scholar of bibliology. James Leo Garrett suggests that Dockery's writings on the doctrine of Scripture, including his expertise in hermeneutics, represented the most reflective aspects of the SBC inerrancy controversy. But unlike some conservative SBC theologians, Dockery was more ironic in his demeanor. He was willing to find ways to cooperate with, and in some select cases, even employ Baptists who were somewhat less theologically conservative than himself. And he was interested in more closely intersecting with the wider evangelical movement. All these themes became identified with what might be called the Dockery vision for Union University. He attempted to position the school as a national Christian university on par with, say, a Wheaton or a Calvin or a Gordon, but deeply rooted in its Baptist identity and aligned closely with conservative Southern Baptist thought, while also being more broadly evangelical in its ethos and priorities, like those CCCU-type schools. Dockery summarized his vision with the phrase, evangelical by conviction, Baptist by tradition. Dockery implemented his vision through a number of different initiatives. Like other Baptist schools, Union had already joined the CCCU in the early 1990s, so Dockery was able to build upon some initial evangelical engagement in promoting his particular evangelical Baptist vision for higher education. One of his earliest acts was to establish a Center for Faculty Development, which was tasked with helping professors to think about their respective disciplines from the perspective of a Christian worldview and to integrate faith into their teaching and research. The center sponsored workshops and reading groups that fostered discussions about the same books that were being read by faculties at places like Wheaton or Taylor or Gordon. Dockery's particular approach to worldview and faith and learning integration was not simplistically biblicist, just kind of proof texting here and there, but rather sought to frame these concepts in dialogue with what he called the Christian intellectual tradition and what others sometimes refer to as the Great Tradition. In so doing, Dockery, along with his longtime friend and collaborator Timothy George, was seeking to articulate evangelical Baptist identity as a particular expression of classical Christian orthodoxy. Both men have also been involved in promoting the Manhattan Declaration, a 2009 statement that calls for Christians across ecclesial traditions to cooperate for the sake of promoting the sanctity of human life, the dignity of biblical marriage, and religious liberty for all people. George served as one of the 3 original drafters of the document, while Dockery co-edited a 2019 collection of essays dedicated to further emphasizing the priorities articulated in the Manhattan Declaration. As an aside, in more recent years, Dockery and George have been influential in the development of the Center for Baptist Renewal, which describes itself as a group of conservative, evangelical Baptists committed to a retrieval of the great tradition of the historic church for the renewal of Baptist faith and practice. As one of the original fellows of the center, I can assure you that nearly every early conversation we had was about how to champion the emphases of Dockery and George among the current generation of Southern Baptist pastors and scholars. Next week, the Center for Baptist Renewal is hosting its inaugural event at Oklahoma Baptist University, and we'll be talking about retrieving evangelical and Baptist history for the sake of renewing contemporary churches. I guarantee Dockery's name will be dropped during that meeting multiple times. But back to Union. Dockery also invited strategic guest lecturers from around the world of evangelical higher education to champion evangelical concepts among the university's faculty and students. Most notably, in 2000, he established a scholar in residence program that includes a public lectureship, guest teaching in classes, and consulting with faculty. Early scholars in residence included people I've already mentioned, like Arthur Holmes and James Sire, to scions of evangelical higher education, as well as the ethicist David Cook, then at Wheaton College, and British evangelical theologian Anthony Thistleton. Dockery showed a particular affinity for other Baptists who also identified with the wider evangelical movement. So 2 of the early scholars in residence were James Leo Garrett, a Southern Baptist theologian who was the most influential advocate for the notion that Southern Baptists are evangelicals. Of course, Dr. Garrett taught here for much of his career, as well as Millard Erickson, a Baptist theologian who was more identified with the wider evangelical movement, also a one-time professor at Southwestern Seminary. Interestingly, Dockery edited Festschriften for both of these men, collections of honorific essays whenever a scholar becomes seasoned and gets near retirement. It's a way that nerds honor other nerds for their contribution to nerddom. Dockery's hiring practices also reflected his vision of an evangelical Baptist university. Cabinet-level administrators and faculty members in what became known as the School of Theology and Missions were all required to be members of Tennessee Baptist churches in friendly cooperation with the Southern Baptist Convention. That meant they couldn't be moderate churches. And as with many other Baptist institutions, a majority of the faculty across the university were Southern Baptists. However, Dockery also intentionally recruited evangelical professors from other denominational traditions and from non-denominational backgrounds, sometimes placing them in strategic leadership positions, such as academic deans, department chairs, and directors of academic institutes and centers. Dockery also took the unusual step, at least for a Baptist institution, of drafting a confessional statement that all professors needed to verbally affirm as part of the interview process. However, the statement was not explicitly Baptist, but rather summarized what might be called mere evangelical Christianity. This approach to confessional identity was unlike both the generally non-confessional approach of more moderate schools or the more strictly confessional approach of more conservative schools that were simply adopting the Baptist Faith and Message 2000 and requiring all professors to sign that. Dockery wanted something in between, an evangelical statement of faith with a requirement that certain key faculty and leaders be conservative Southern Baptists. That was how they threaded that needle. During Dockery's tenure, Union also hosted a number of conferences that promoted his vision for an evangelical Baptist identity. 3 examples will suffice here. In 2004 and 2007, Union held 2 conferences on the topic of Baptist identity. The proceedings of those meetings were subsequently published in 2009 as a book, Southern Baptist Identity and Evangelical Denomination Faces the Future. The title of the book is noteworthy, but so is the publisher, Crossway, an evangelical publishing house rather than Lifeway or a Baptist-related university press. In 2009, Union hosted a conference on the topic, Southern Baptist Evangelicals and the Future of Denominationalism. 2 years later, the proceedings of that conference were published. Whereas the second book was published by B&H Academic, it's noteworthy that the contributors included Michael Lindsay, now the president of Taylor University, and former Wheaton president Dwayne Litfin, both of whom served in evangelical contexts. Furthermore, Southern Baptist contributors such as Dockery, Timothy George, and Albert Moeller, as well as the present lecturer, contributed essays that address the intersection of Southern Baptist and evangelical life. Dockery's Union University became a role model for other Baptist institutions interested in cultivating an evangelical Baptist identity that is more conservative than most moderate Baptist institutions, but a bit more cosmopolitan than Baptist institutions that are influenced by fundamentalism. Dockery championed his evangelical Baptist vision for higher education in a variety of different ways. Shortly after arriving at Union, he began receiving invitations to lecture on higher education at other Baptist institutions, including over half the schools affiliated with IABCU, that International Baptist Group, plus all 6 Southern Baptist seminaries. Many of these lectures were dedicated to the heretofore evangelical topics of Christian worldview or faith and learning integration, though applied to other emphases Baptists often cherish, such as biblical inerrancy and authority, global missions, and close partnership with local churches. In 2004, Dockery delivered the Hester Lectures for the International Association of Baptist Colleges and Universities for the first time, a sign of the esteem with which he was held among his fellow Baptist educators. He also lectured periodically in non-Baptist contexts, such as, just to give a few examples, Azusa Pacific University, Biola University, Wheaton College, the CCCU, and even the Southern Association of Colleges and Schools, SACS, the accreditor. In addition to his widespread lecturing opportunities, Dockery also promoted his vision through a raft of publications, many of which originated as lectures. In 1999, he co-edited The Future of Christian Higher Education, a compendium that originated as a conference at Union. The contributors included several Southern Baptist educators, but also evangelical scholars such as Joel Carpenter, Millard Erickson, and Arthur Holmes. 3 years later, Dockery co-edited Shaping a Christian Worldview, the foundation of Christian higher education. In this book, all the contributors were faculty and staff at Union who were applying a Christian worldview to their respective academic disciplines and university departments. In 2012, a similar edited volume took the same approach with faith and learning integration. Yet another co-edited work, Christian Higher Education, Faith, Teaching, and Learning in the Evangelical Tradition, was published in 2018, addressing these same topics, though this time with contributors from a variety of Southern Baptist and evangelical institutions, not just Union. In 2008, Dockery published his most noteworthy volume on higher education, Renewing Minds, Serving Church and Society Through Christian Higher Education. The book drew together themes that Dockery had written and lectured on widely since the mid-1990s, synthesizing them into a coherent manifesto. Though B&H Academic published Renewing Minds, and though Dockery regularly referenced his own Baptist convictions and context, The book was written for a broadly evangelical readership. The fact that it was endorsed by a variety of both evangelical and Southern Baptist scholars and educators demonstrates the way Dockery had become a bridge figure between these two increasingly overlapping worlds. Capitalizing on this broad appeal, in 2012, Dockery and Timothy George launched a series of short books with Crossway titled Reclaiming the Christian Intellectual Tradition. The purpose of the series is to introduce key academic disciplines from the perspective of a Christian worldview, putting each discipline in dialogue with the Christian intellectual tradition. The series editors co-authored the lead book, which introduces students to the Christian intellectual tradition and its role in the history of higher education. Additional series contributors include both Southern Baptist and non-Baptist evangelicals who teach at institutions as diverse as Baylor, Union, North Greenville, Wheaton College, Biola, and Grove City. I put on the slide my own volume in that series, just as a reminder, every copy of that yellow book you buy, Feed Starving Children that my wife gave birth to. A final way Dockery exported his vision was through directly mentoring other Baptist educational leaders. During his years at Union, Dockery frequently invited new or aspiring administrators from other Baptist institutions to shadow him and his leadership team. Some of these individuals later took up leadership roles in Baptist-related schools, and over the years, Dockery delivered inaugural addresses or similar lectures for several of the Baptist presidents whom he had formally or informally mentored. That's my president, Gene Fent, who used to be the chief academic officer under David Dockery at Union University. More broadly, he also mentored non-Baptist evangelical leaders through a CCCU program for new presidents. Several of Dockery's administrative protégés at Union became presidents or provosts at other institutions, some Baptist-related, some evangelical, a few even non-sectarian. Not surprisingly, considering his mentoring experiences, in 2011, Dockery edited a leadership book. Once again, nearly all the contributors worked in the context of Christian higher education. Several of them were Dockery protégés, and the list included both Southern Baptists and non-Baptist evangelicals. Dockery was not only modeling his vision at Union and speaking and writing about it for a wider audience, but he was also equipping others to lead their respective institutions to adopt a similar approach that was suitable for their particular contexts. In 2014, Dockery stepped down as the president of Union University and became the president of Trinity International University, where he served until his retirement in 2019. The university, most famous for its widely respected Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, is a broadly evangelical institution with historic ties to the evangelical free church tradition. Dockery, who had spent much of his adult life as a convictional Baptist engaging with and learning from non-Baptist evangelicals, now found himself as the Southern Baptist president of an evangelical university. He eventually took 4 administrators with him from Union to Trinity, while a 5th became a Trinity regent, a trustee, thus exporting elements of the Dockery vision to the new institution. However, Dockery also continued to be active in Southern Baptist life, attending the SBC annual meeting, speaking widely at Baptist institutions. For the sake of time, I'm not going to say much more about his time at Trinity because I want to address something different. In 2019, Dockery accepted a role at Southwestern Seminary as professor of theology, theologian in residence, and special consultant to the president. Dockery had previously lived in the Metroplex for over a decade, earning his MDiv at Southwestern before undertaking further graduate studies at TCU and UT Arlington. After returning to Southwestern, Dockery subsequently became editor of the Southwestern Journal of Theology, served the seminary as interim provost, and became the founding director of the Dockery Center for Global Evangelical Theology. Of course, he is now the interim president of this wonderful seminary. Though Dockery plays a crucial role in the Southwestern community, his influence is not limited to this institution. His vision for Christian higher education continues to have an enormous impact across our nation and even around the world. in 2020, Dockery became the founding president of the International Alliance for Christian Education, the IACE. IACE is both an umbrella organization and a network. It is an umbrella organization for Christ-centered education at every level, including private Christian K-12 schools, Bible colleges, liberal arts colleges, comprehensive universities, and theological seminaries. Thousands of institutions around the world maintain some level of affiliation with IACE, whether through their own individual institutional membership or by being affiliated with organizations such as the Association for Biblical Higher Education, the Association of Christian Schools International, two different groups that are part of IACE. IACE is also a network where both academic institutions and like-minded organizations can partner together for the sake of promoting the flourishing of Christ-centered education. IACE sponsors 2 annual conferences, both of which are held at the Riley Center at Southwestern. In February, representatives from member institutions and partner organizations gather for an annual meeting. This is a time of information, encouragement, and equipping. In early summer, IACE sponsors an annual faculty development conference. This is a time for faculty and administrators from member institutions to come together to learn how to be more faithful teachers, scholars, and leaders. In both of these annual conferences and in every one-off event sponsored by IACE, the Dockery vision shines through. Members and partners rally around their commitment to a Christian worldview, the integration of faith and learning, and the Christian intellectual tradition. They partner together for the sake of promoting faithful cultural engagement and ultimately, by God's grace, cultural renewal through the ministry of Christ-centered education. While IACE is a pan-evangelical organization, Baptists are well represented. At present, nearly half of the member institutions are Baptist, mostly in the Southern Baptist tradition. In addition, a number of non-denominational institutions are led by Baptist presidents and/or Baptist chief academic officers. Dockery's evangelical Baptist sensibilities, as articulated in the Dockery vision, continue to influence Christ-centered institutions in a variety of ecclesial traditions to the glory of God and for the sake of human flourishing. Now, I'd like to close this lecture with a more personal word, which I've adapted from a brief reflection I wrote several years ago for a collection of essays in Dockery's honor titled Convictional Civility. I attended Bruton Parker College, a small Baptist college in southeast Georgia. My Christian studies professors at that time identified as moderates, and they had disengaged from Southern Baptist denominational life during the previous decade. Theologically, they were center-left on the spectrum of Southern Baptist thought at that time. In part because of my general interests in history and theology, and partly because of my professors' interpretations of recent denominational controversies, I became very interested in modern Southern Baptist history. I read everything I could on what my pastor called the conservative resurgence and what my professors called the fundamentalist takeover. I wrestled with my own convictions about all the debatable issues, especially biblical inerrancy, before coming to the conclusion that the conservative faith of my home church was still good enough for me. Before I graduated from college, I already knew that I wanted to pursue a PhD and study some aspect of modern Baptist history or theology. I understood that I was choosing a vocation fraught with potential complications. Studying Baptist history is more than a merely academic exercise if one is a Southern Baptist. It can be politically tricky in a post-controversy world. As I continued reading widely in Baptist history and theology, I couldn't escape the feeling that many scholars were using history as an apologetic for their particular beliefs and/or were being far too polemical for a discipline that, at least in theory, is more descriptive than prescriptive. Some historians were progressive individualists who framed Baptist identity as the forward march of personal liberty of conscience. Most doctrines for them seemed up for grabs, even doctrines I understood to be foundational to the faith. Other scholars were more theologically conservative, but some of them came off as shrill and reactionary. They didn't always paint a flattering picture of what it means to be a theologically conservative Southern Baptist. Simply put, my moderate professors were Christ-like and friendly. My conservative friends were more orthodox and evangelistic. But shouldn't we be both? So as a collegian and a wannabe Baptist historian, I found myself increasingly thankful for the works of David Dockery. I first became familiar with him through his book chapters and journal articles about Baptists and the doctrine of Scripture. Then I read chapters that recounted Baptist historical theology or opined about the future of Baptist theology. I also learned about the Broadus Robertson tradition and the theologies of Herschel Hobbs and Millard Erickson. I listened to some audio recordings of lectures that Dockery had delivered at Southern Seminary, where I soon began my own master's studies. I also read popular articles in magazines like Christianity Today, programmatic essays on Christian higher education, and his writings related to postmodernism. I began to recommend Dockery's writings to others. By the way, when you're 21 or 22 and you're doing that, people think you're nerdy. But I did it. I was surprised when I learned that Dockery was not a historian by profession. He seemed to understand recent Southern Baptist history and the history of Baptist thought about as well as most of the professional historians I was reading. Most of them were moderates. But he also seemed nice. What stood out most about Dockery was that he was never pugnacious. He approached some of the most controversial topics in Baptist history and theology as if neighbor love really matters, not just winning the debate. The same was true of his friend Timothy George, who similarly influenced my vocational journey. It was no surprise then to learn that Dockery had also written a great deal about the importance of the Great Commandment, to love God and love our neighbor. I told my pastor at the time that I wished Union University had a divinity school so that I could attend there for my seminary training, but alas, they did not. By the time I began seminary, I knew that there were different sorts of conservatives among Southern Baptists. I wanted to be a David Dockery conservative who could use my scholarly gifts to interpret Southern Baptist history and theology, but without being unnecessarily provocative or even polemical when it wasn't appropriate to be polemical. And I certainly didn't want to be a jerk. Throughout my MDiv and PhD studies, I continued to read nearly everything Dockery wrote, even on topics that were of less personal or professional interest to me. In 2004, I finally had the chance to meet Dockery at the First Baptist Identity Conference at Union, and though he wouldn't remember it now, probably, it was Greg Wills who first introduced me to David Dockery. That's why his picture's up there, not for any bad reason. I love Dr. Wills. He's sitting in the back. As a scholar of Baptist history and thought, as well as a convictional and committed Southern Baptist churchman, I've continued to be shaped by Dockery's influence. His 2009 book, Southern Baptist Consensus and Renewal, which I mentioned at the very beginning of the lecture, continues to articulate much of my own hope for the future of Southern Baptists. Some of his essays on Baptist historical theology are required reading in my doctoral seminars, because I think he helpfully frames the Baptist theological past and offers a hopeful vision for the Baptist theological future. His contributions to the Southern Baptist, let's call them family conversations, about the Great Commission resurgence and Calvinism debate have been sane and measured, two words not often used in relation to those two conversations. More recently, when I stepped into academic administration in 2015, I returned to those Dockery books and articles about higher education that I had previously read, and I started paying closer attention to everything new that he was writing in that field because it was becoming my world. On a more personal note, Dockery has been exceedingly kind to me over the years. From early on, he took an interest in my own ministry, offering me wise counsel on several occasions. As a young scholar, two of my earliest writing opportunities came about when he invited me to contribute to books that he was editing. We continue to collaborate on various projects, including a forthcoming theological handbook and a series on Baptist systematic theology. Dan Darling mentioned that yesterday. Several years ago, I wrote down my life goal as part of an exercise in personal leadership development. This is what I wrote: to promote the renewal of Southern Baptist doctrine, devotion, and practice for the sake of healthier local churches and the fulfillment of the Great Commission. I'm not sure if that would be my life goal if I had not become acquainted with the writings of David Dockery, and later the person that is David Dockery. But this much I am certain of: the way that I think about that life goal is Dockery-esque. I'm thankful to be a David Dockery sort of conservative. For such a time as this, I'm thankful that the Dockery vision is helping to steer the ship at Southwestern Seminary and Texas Baptist College. And it has been my great honor and joy to reflect on Dockery's vision in this lecture today. Thank you very much.